They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of the children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günter, there's one over there, get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
Hamburg, June 1945. The Second World War is over and Germany lies in ruins. People are slowly learning to rebuild their lives. 20 years previously, the world had no idea what awaited it. In the late 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, a fierce power struggle raged in Germany. The economic crisis saw voters turning in particular to the two workers' parties, the Social Democrats and the Communists. At first, little Günter Lux had no idea of his parents' political convictions.
But I had been influenced so much that even as a small child, their communist ideals already had a decisive effect on me. My parents associated with leading communists in Hamburg, so I got to hear quite a lot.
Günter Lux was born in Hamburg in 1928. His upbringing was characterized entirely by communist values. Together with his elder brother, Günter grew up in the Red East of Hamburg. His parents were members of the Communist Party. Its Social Democrat rivals were dismissed as social fascists.
Their view was that when they had got rid of the whole rotten lot, the capitalists, the exploiters, we'd all be better off. But they had no idea of how things would continue after that. And later we saw what that led to.
Elisabeth Lux always played an active role. In the east of Hamburg, Günter and Hermann's mother was known as Red Lieschen. A convinced communist, she believed firmly in socialist values. When the Communist Party held its meetings, the Lux family was always present. For the children, that was simply the way things were. They were involved and followed the examples set by their parents.
I can remember us holding hands with our mother when we attended their demonstrations. The grown-ups shouted out, "Red Front," so we youngsters thought we'd shout as well. We had little paper flags with a hammer and sickle. We'd wave at them and bellow what we thought sounded like Red Front, but wasn't.
Born in Hamburg, since 1925, Ernst Thälmann had been chairman of the Communist Party. The children found his nickname, Teddy, confusing.
When Teddy came, we were disappointed because we had been expecting a big teddy bear. My mother didn't like him so much because his speeches went on and on. She always said that by the end she'd stopped listening, and his words were battle cries. But he was close to the people. He could speak Low German dialect, and he lived in Eilbeck, where we moved to later. His parents lived on the Warnsbecker Chaussee. That's why we knew him a bit more closely.
For a while, politics still remained of secondary importance to the children, so the exceptionally long speeches given by adults were of no interest to them.
The Communist Party meetings were held on the Moorweide or in the municipal park. As kids, we were only interested in the music, in the bands. We didn't understand the grown-up speeches. We found them incredibly boring. Sometimes, when our parents told us we had to accompany them, we'd start complaining. We had no idea what was being said. We were unhappy because the adults were usually so angry, cursing and shouting. And when the police turned up in their vans and jumped out, and the street battles began, we had trouble getting away with our mother.
Back then, Thälmann described the National Socialists as a peripheral phenomenon of the final phase in the development of capitalism. The communists' enemy was the social fascist.
For us children, the SA people were the worst of the worst. The police were evil and the social fascists were evil. But we had no idea what that meant. My brother's father was a typesetter with the Reichsbanner organization. He too wore uniform. And whenever he visited us, an argument always broke out between my father and Uncle Walter, as we called him. We kids hated that because we liked Uncle's social fascist. He always brought us something. We used to say, "Uncle Social Fascist, have you got something nice for us?" And he'd reply, "Of course, I always have." And that raised doubts in my mind. If the social fascists are all like Uncle Walter, I thought, they can't be evil. But if I said anything, my father would then tell me to be quiet. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he'd say. So then I had to shut up.
January the 30th, 1933 changed everything. After the Nazis seized power, the communists saw themselves confronted by an enemy they had underestimated and who was now their greatest threat.
Later, when the Nazis were in power and my uncle came to visit us, he told my father, "You were wrong to call us social fascists. The enemy is on the right."
The Nazi takeover was a disaster for the Lux family. The Communist Party was banned, and Hermann and Elisabeth had to be careful what they said and to whom. But Red Lieschen still offered resistance on a minor scale.
When she went into a shop and saw posters saying, "If you came in as a German, you have to use the Hitler greeting," then she always used to say, "Hein Dittmar." That made the shopkeeper laugh. He'd point at the sign when she came in. But you had to be careful because there were lots of people who would denounce you. Then you'd be picked up, as it was called.
Political arrests were now an everyday occurrence. But what exactly did it mean to say someone had been picked up? For a 5-year-old, that was hard to understand.
I asked the block leader what it meant. He told me that people were then taken to a concentration camp. I had no idea what that was. It's a place where unreliable, idle people are taught to do useful work, he said. If they mend their ways and are prepared to work again, they are released. There's nothing bad about it. Naturally, I believed what he told me. How should I have known any different?
Through their slogans, the Nazis recruited more members for the NSDAP. They were even successful with some comrades.
I only know, for example, that Knut, someone from St. Georg, whom we knew very well, came to my father wearing an SA uniform and said, "Hermann, come and join us. Look, we've been given free uniforms and boots. We too want socialism, but just for Germans." My father's response was evasive. "I'll think about it," he told Knut. He was afraid of being reported. So he fobbed him off. "Give me a bit of time," he said. "I'll think about it." We children liked Knut. He always brought us something. One day, when we were standing on the stairs, I said to him, "Uncle Knut, I think your uniform is great. I'd like to wear one like that. But what would be just fantastic is if you also had a Soviet star on your cap." "I don't think that would go down very well," he laughed. As a child, you see things differently.
It was such childlike views of the world and its values that the Nazis exploited. To them, a naive child was a future voter. And not only that, it had already become clear at the NSDAP's Nuremberg rally in September 1934 in which direction Hitler was steering his youth.
Nach Ihrem Befehl, mein Führer, steht hier eine Jugend, die keine Klasse und keine Kaste kennt. Darum wollen auch wir treu sein. Adolf Hitler, der Führer der deutschen Jugend, hat das Wort. Meine deutsche Jugend, wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst nicht verweichlicht wird, sondern dass es hart sein kann. Und ihr müsst euch in der Jugend dafür stehlen. Ihr müsst lernen, Entbehrungen auf euch zu nehmen, ohne jeweils zusammenzubrechen. Und wenn von uns nichts mehr übrig sein wird, dann werdet ihr die Fahne, die wir einst aus dem Nichts hochgezogen haben, in euren Fäusten halten müssen.
Wer die Jugend auf seiner Seite hat, hat die Zukunft.
Those who have the youth of the country on their side have the future in their pocket. The National Socialist state needed new blood, also in the form of soldiers, so it wanted to win over adults, who after all were the voters. But at the same time, it also had to win over the next generation, which in any case it could educate in this spirit right from the start. So it was only logical to address young people and get them on its side.
Hilke Lorenz, a journalist and author who lives in Stuttgart, has focused on the subject of childhood in war for many years.
The National Socialists cleverly geared their propaganda to the world of experience of children and adolescents. In normal times, children joined the Scouts or the Girl Guides. The Nazis offered the Hitler Youth Movement, which in many ways was similar to those two organizations. But it was fundamentally a building block in the great plan of binding children and adolescents to the National Socialist state.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
Conformity, obedience, uniforms. Young heads were manipulated by the Nazis, and successfully too.
There are numerous stories of children from communist or social democrat homes also being equally as wild about the uniforms. This led to conflicts within families, which the Nazis certainly didn't find inopportune. In this way, they were able to separate children from their parents.
Belonging is a crucial part of growing up. Günter Lux didn't want to be excluded either, and most of his school friends were already members of the Jungvolk, the young section of the Hitler Youth.
First of all, as a boy, I was fascinated by the uniform. My classmates, who were already in the Hitler Youth, were marching in rank and file. I said I couldn't join them because I didn't have a uniform. But the Hitler Youth even took boys without a uniform and then put them in the middle, flanked left and right by boys in uniform, whenever the Jungvolk marched. That, I was told, was possible. But first, I had to become a member. My father, however, wouldn't hear of it.
Hermann Lux had no intention of exposing his son to further indoctrination by the National Socialists. But there was little resistance within the country. The anti-Semitism decreed by the Nazis was soon visible throughout Germany. Hitler made the Jews the scapegoat for the tense economic situation, and his plan paid off. Hermann Jax was Jewish, his wife Ellie Christian. Ruth, their daughter, enjoyed a carefree childhood until everything suddenly changed.
My parents often took me out in a paddle boat, so you could say I grew up in nature. That was until 1932, when the first Nazis turned up during a camping holiday by the Baltic. A good friend of my father's was camping with us, and my father said he didn't want to get him into trouble. "So we won't be coming here again," he told us. That was my first encounter with National Socialism.
Ruth Winkelmann was born in September 1928 in the Jewish hospital in Berlin. Judaism played only a subordinate role in her childhood. But after the Nazis seized power, it became clear to Hermann and Ellie Jax that daily life for the family would change completely. When she was 6 years old, little Ruth started school. Her father had recognized the dangers early on and taken measures to protect his daughter.
When I started school in 1934, my father told me that, since I was half Jewish, it would be better for me to attend a Jewish school. He didn't want me to be teased and baited. That was something I knew.
Jews were baited at every opportunity. They were abused and ostracized, and most Germans allowed themselves to be swept along by the racial fanaticism of the Nazis. But why? That might have been hard for adults to comprehend. For children, it was simply impossible.
At that time, Jewish citizens were an integral part of society. Franz had a friend he'd known since their days playing in a sandpit. The two were now 10 and were thinking of going to secondary school together. But then suddenly, His friend was no longer allowed to be a friend. Yet we have to take a diversified approach to the influence that was being brought to bear. It didn't just come from what the Führer propagated. The parents also played along. So how strong were parents? How strong could they afford to be? How much of a safety net did the family need in order to survive? In view of the dangerous situation, saying the wrong thing could see a family sent to a work camp or concentration camp and perhaps killed.
On the streets, hatred ruled, and Hitler's henchmen didn't even stop at children. They were systematically ostracized. And they asked questions. Their parents owed them answers. But how were they to come up with any when they themselves could not comprehend what was happening?
Once a month, my mother used to take me for a stroll through town, and we would always go for a meal in a restaurant. We always got a warm welcome, amongst other things, because I was a child with exceptionally good table manners. The waiters liked that. One day, though, there was this sign up saying, "Jews not welcome." And that was the end of that. As you can imagine, we never went there again. But I missed it, even though it was only once a month. It was such a highlight for us.
On November the 10th, 1938, for hours on end, the Nazis destroyed Jewish shops, set fire to synagogues, and terrorized innocent people at random.
I went to school in the Auguststraße in Berlin center. My father and my grandfather always drove me there. The morning after the Kristallnacht, as it became known, there were the first glass fragments in the streets. Shop windows had been smashed. Daubed on those still intact were words like Jewish pig. Sometimes there was a Star of David with a line through it. The further we drove into town, the worse it got. In the Gartenstraße, we saw an Orthodox Jew being beaten up by the SA or the SS. 3 men on one. I found that appalling. I was shaking as I sat between my father and my grandfather. It all affected me deeply.
Nevertheless, little Ruth still went to school that day. On that November the 10th, many people were still unaware of the extent of the pogroms.
I arrived at school, and at first, everything was totally normal. When I went in, we were taken straight to the hall. The school was then sealed off. Rubbish was placed in front of the entrance, so we couldn't get either in or out. That was very impressive. Then there were these rioting gangs going up and down the Auguststraße, banging on the doors and windows. That was really scary.
The children in the school on the Auguststraße were frightened. All the exits were sealed. The teachers discussed how they might get the girls out and keep them safe from the bully boys.
After thinking things through, the teachers and the headmaster decided to take us out through the attics, 2 at a time, with a small wait after each pair. We surfaced in the Tucholskystraße. It was very worrying, and we couldn't imagine that things would get worse. We always reckoned the situation would simmer down.
But the shock ran deep. Günter Lux kept trying to convince his father to let him join the Hitler Youth. In the meantime, his parents were divorced. Günter and his brother were living with their father and his new wife Lizzie. Hermann Lux remained steadfast.
My father said, "You're not joining the Hitler Youth. Times will get better soon, and then you can join the Red Young Storm." And I was happy with that. But on the other hand, I wanted to join the Hitler Youth because my friends were in it. So there I was, teetering between two ideologies. What my mother told me couldn't be wrong. But then again, I was hearing from my teacher that the Führer wanted the best for Germany. So you can imagine that as a young person, I had no idea which way to go.
Günter's parents wanted to protect their son from manipulation, but soon the Nazis took even that right from them.
2 days before war broke out, a Hitler Youth leader came to our home and insisted that my father register me with the Hitler Youth. Now he had absolutely no option. And on September the 1st, 1939, I went to the Hitler Youth Center and was given a helmet, an identity card, and everything else that was necessary. When I got home, Lizzie said, "Come in." They're broadcasting a speech by the Führer. He was railing against the Poles and then said, "Since 5:45, we have been firing back." I took that on board, but it wasn't important to me. I was in the Hitler Youth, and that was important. The war was something secondary. I was glad about it, though. What a pity I'm still small, I thought. I'd love to be a soldier and march into Poland with the others. I already had the Nazi ideology in my head.
That day a dream had come true for Günter Hermann. At last he belonged. But his mother found it hard to take. Her son had turned to the Nazis. However, he hadn't entirely forgotten the values of his upbringing.
Then, when I went home, she said, "Goodbye, my little red Hitler Youth son." I wondered what on earth she meant by that. After all, I wanted to become a young communist. But on the other hand, I also wanted to be in the Hitler Youth because my friends were all in it. It was such a toing and froing between ideologies that it sometimes kept me awake at night. Even when I was in the Hitler Youth and the others were all singing, "Our flag flutters us onwards," under my breath, I was singing, "Brothers, see the red flag." After all, I knew those songs as well. It really was to and fro.
Children were easy prey for the Nazis, who even managed to sow mistrust within families.
You must be careful, my mother told me, even with regard to your brother Hermann. He had already been indoctrinated somewhat by Nazi ideology. "It's strange," she said. "He's always so quiet. Don't let on what happens here. Don't tell anyone that the comrades come round for coffee." I asked her why they wore the Nazi party badge on their lapels. "It's necessary," she said. "We have to deceive the Nazis. But don't say a word to anyone, not even your father."
Günter Lux was torn. Not only were his own convictions being tested, he also had to be careful what he said within his own family. His parents also had to weigh their every word. They had given up any hope of protecting their children from the Nazis.
Today we talk about children being largely at the mercy of peer groups, with parents in certain phases being almost unable to bring their influence to bear. The decisive phase of puberty involves detachment anyway. But if someone is also told, you can do that, you are somebody, in other words, if they have their manly virtues bolstered, then I can well imagine that parents in those days stood even less of a chance of combating this detachment than parents today. After all, in those days it was a deliberate detachment, an exploiting detachment from the childhood home.
Even though some adults in Germany offered resistance, in the case of children, the Nazis were almost always successful.
The social life of a child is always confined within narrow boundaries. That is why little children tend to be immune to a bogey which looms up and disseminates views that are totally perverse. The most receptive and probably most endangered age group is comprised of mature junior school pupils and, above all, those who are going out into the big wide world. They suddenly see values they have established for themselves confronted by some Überworld.
Andreas Krüger is a specialist in child and youth psychiatry in Hamburg. As a dream therapist, he knows the importance of establishing human values in childhood.
When a child has developed intellectual capabilities and a concept of the world which corresponds to human and humanistic ideals, and is then suddenly called upon to embrace hatred, separation, humiliation and debasement, coupled with what we call a narcissistic upgrading of his own person, that, I believe, basically corrupts everything that is of value in a human being.
Wherever you looked, in the late 30s, Nazi propaganda was visible all over Germany. There was virtually no escape from the inflammatory slogans and the glorification of war. Parents who had previously been able to protect their children from this now saw themselves confronted by the brutal reality of National Socialism. Their authority was shaken. What had once been taken for granted was no longer valid. From now on, the state dictated how things had to be.
Our teacher told us that the Jews were there to take our money. A picture was painted to make us think that with his Nordic features, a German was a better person. Everyone else was an Untermensch, a subhuman creature. I was close to believing that, but my mother kept telling me exactly the opposite. They are no different from you, she would say. They are just the same as we are. After that, I didn't believe everything our teachers and the Hitler Youth leaders told us.
Children were taught to marginalize, to hate everything that did not correspond to the defined dimensions. Only an Aryan person was a good person. All others were to be ostracized. Teachers are role models for children. In the eyes of a child, they are always right. Yet in Nazi Germany, teachers fed their pupils on inflammatory slogans and propaganda on a daily basis. Brotherly love and compassion had long since been erased from the curriculum.
Everything they had learned about human relations, about coexistence, was cast aside. Sadly, few people from the time are prepared to talk about their innermost thoughts. That is a pity, because we as therapists, and especially me as a child therapist, could learn a lot from them. What effect did this propaganda, this external world, have on their inner world? I think that for many people, the most damaging aspect of all is that the humanity they had internalized was now being questioned.
The Nazis not only manipulated their children, they also used them to manipulate adults. National Socialist leaders showed themselves in public with children and had themselves filmed and photographed with them. After all, someone who is nice to children can't be a bad person.
Such pictures are always taken with the idea in mind that children bring harmlessness to a situation. I'm not certain whether every child standing there knew who or what it was cheering, but it was the parents who took their offspring along, who sought contact and who became immersed in the atmosphere. The underlying reason, perhaps, was that going to see the Führer had something of an event character to it. It was staged as something the whole family had to experience, and the pictures were intended to show that such visits were an integral part of life. He belongs to all of us, we all belong to him, and we now have a common future.
As long as it suited their purposes, the Nazis stopped at nothing. At home in Hamburg, Günter Lux and his brother Hermann were expected to earn a few pennies to put towards the housekeeping. Twice a week, after school, Günter delivered goods on his bike for a pharmacy. One trip took him regularly to the Jewish hospital in the Jonsallee near the university.
The pharmacy employed me as an errand boy, and I used to take medicines round to the hospital. The doctors and nurses there were always so nice and friendly. One day, they all had a Star of David on their coats. I was horrified. I had no idea that they were all Jews. My teacher had always said that the Jews were public enemies, parasites, and so on, that they were bent solely on evil. But these nice doctors can't be like that, I thought. When I got back to the pharmacy, I had to weigh out tea upstairs. When I started crying, the pharmacist told me that he understood why I was so shaken, and said I would not have to go there again.
What Günter Lux did not know at the time was that Jews in Germany were not only being ostracized and separated from the rest of society through the yellow star, Jewish citizens had to report daily to collecting points, like this one in Stuttgart. There they were registered, had their valuables confiscated, and were put on a train belonging to the Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, without knowing where they were going. In fact, they were being taken to the Nazis' work and extermination camps. By now, no one was safe from the despotism. Ruth's cousin Egon was just 17 when, on an autumn day in 1941, he said goodbye to his mother to report for a night shift. But Egon never arrived at his place of work.
It was an absolute nightmare. Above all, Egon was a lad you could rely on, someone who would never have done anything wrong. He was such an upright young chap.
Egon Jacks had gone 15 minutes early into a shop which had set opening times for Jews. The men in black coats were already waiting for him. Egon was deported to Riga and murdered by the Nazis. Contempt turned into ostracism. Ostracism was followed by deportation. Deportation ended in genocide. Hatred of an ethnic group turned into hatred of the individual. Those affected were tortured by the question of why, but they received no answer.
First, you begin to doubt yourself. This can be explained psychologically. A human being cannot cope with a feeling of powerlessness. Someone points a finger at him and he gets a star stuck on his coat. With most people, it was probably the case that in order to escape from this traumatic experience, this feeling of impotence, they blamed themselves. Feelings of shame and guilt went some way to compensate for this powerlessness. It appears to be my fault. There must be some truth in that. Then, although I have to accept my guilt and feel inferior, as a final consequence, there remains a scintilla of hope that, if I were different, the world would be in order again. And a human being needs this basic principle of order in humanity simply in order to survive.
Humanity had long since disappeared because the order was to show no mercy, and the Nazis complied. Irrespective of sex or age, Jews were deported, forced to work, or starved in a concentration camp or ghetto, tormented and killed. What children in particular had to experience is simply unimaginable.
The conditions were created deliberately to humiliate people, to convince them totally and utterly that they were subhuman. And no individual could ever withstand that kind of psychological bombardment. The experiences which impacted on children in particular in the camps cannot be handled mentally. Our psychobiology is not geared to coping with this kind of permanent stress. Fear generates stress. After all, you want to do something to escape from the source of your fear, but you can't. In the long run, the situation damages a person's self-image because it begins with a total breach of confidence. Human relationships become impossible. The community no longer has any value because the community has ostracized me, and in the worst possible case, it will kill me.
Days, weeks and months passed, and still there was no end to the suffering in sight. For many children, the natural reaction of their own body was a big help.
When biology is clear that there is no way out for you, it's like a gentle transition into the hereafter. Something in your head goes click. A fuse blows, and dissociative processes dissolve the situation, which is no longer compatible with life. They create a gentle transition to the hereafter. Children who had resigned, who could no longer pull themselves together, even if they wanted to, and just cowered there, also suffered dissociative processes in the sense of biological mercy. There are survivors who simply have no recollections.
Ellie and Hermann Jacks suspected that terrible things were happening in the camps and wanted at all costs to protect their daughters Ruth and Esther. The children were regarded as half Jewish. The Jacks heard of something called an Aryanization application and went to see a civil servant.
Herr Papenfuss advised my parents to separate so that they could then submit an Aryanization application for us. It would only be accepted, he told them, if they split up. But the Nazis saw to that themselves and had the marriage dissolved. It was a very difficult time for me. I wasn't allowed to see my father anymore. But we used to arrange to meet once a fortnight at an uncle's.
In addition to all the fears and changes, children in the Third Reich also had to cope with the bombing raids.
What changed most of all for children through the bombing raids was that they saw that their parents were no longer in control of their own lives. Their parents were no longer the people who protected them, who were able to guarantee their safety. Children had to experience their parents' loss of control.
Memories of the bombing raids still haunt those children today.
Was ich am meisten erinnere, ist der Geruch.
What I remember most is the smell of rubble and things that had been charred. And I clearly remember hearing the words, "Down into the cellar," whenever an air raid began. In the cellar, we used to cling to one another, adults and children. Naturally, we were all terrified. Then someone would run up and see what damage had been caused. With some buildings, the entire facade was missing. You could see people's furniture. And everyone would be asking if there had been any casualties.
Monika Jeter was born in Berlin in 1940. Above all, she remembers the routine when the alarm sounded.
When we heard the all clear, we'd go upstairs to see what had happened. At first, the damage wasn't much, but then the air raids began to occur more and more often. You no longer felt safe. Even if you were able to return to your apartment, you were always on tenterhooks because you never knew when the next air raid was coming. I remember that fairly clearly.
As Allied bombing raids increased, the destruction in Germany's towns and cities rose dramatically. When the sirens began to wail, it was dangerous to be out on the street. People had to head at once to their nearest bunker. Günter Lux also remembers. In 1940, he was 12 years old.
The air raid sirens started sounding in 1940. That was when the first British aircraft appeared. There was a factory opposite our house, and it had installed sirens. It was a long, drawn-out sound with 3 intervals. When all hell broke loose, we kids thought it was great. Then we had to go down into the cellar. The block leader told us to switch off all our lights. There was a blackout. Cars had to have their headlamps covered with just a small slit open. Even bicycles couldn't show a light.
The air raid warnings soon became part of everyday life, and for many children were nothing more than a big adventure. Often they just didn't realize the threat to life and limb.
We didn't take it at all seriously. We didn't go down into the cellar. We stayed outside. It was great. The flak searchlights crisscrossing as they scanned the sky with their huge beams. The major cities, don't forget, were surrounded by flak and searchlight emplacements.
It was a game. The children waited tensely to see what would happen next in the sky. But Günter Lux watched the spectacle with mixed feelings.
When an aircraft was hit, my friends would give a big cheer. But I felt sympathy for the man who was sitting inside. And I thought about what would happen if a wing fell off. The searchlights illuminated everything, and once an aircraft was caught in the light of 2 of them, the aircraft was always doomed. So I was always happy to see parachutes open. I knew then that the crew would be safe. There were some children who said they ought to be shot. But I thought that was awful. I couldn't say so, however. I was glad to see the parachutes disappear out of the beam of light in one piece and know that the man would land safely somewhere.
Few children even realized that human lives were at stake. A hit just meant one wrecked aircraft more on their adventure playground.
The next day we'd set out and collect shell fragments and swap them with one another. If one fragment had a guide ring, it was worth 5 others. And if you found a light metal bomb fragment, you could get 10 other bits of debris for it. But the exchange value soon sank. Then we stopped collecting altogether.
And it would all get a lot worse. The war was by no means over.